So to begin with, Isaiah 53, particularly Isaiah 53:7. So this chapter really is actually quite difficult in Hebrew. There are a lot of things in here that are very tricky from a grammatical standpoint. We're going to look at just one of these things in Isaiah 53, verse 7. I have pulled up here three different translations: NIV, NLT, ESV. So New International Version, New Living Translation, and the English Standard Version. These are very popular translations, and they also represent a spectrum of translation philosophies, which is something that we've talked about on our podcast. You can go check out our series on translation philosophy and how to translate the New Testament. So the ESV is going to be more word for word or even morpheme for morpheme. So what that means is basically they're going to take one Greek or Hebrew unit of meaning and they're going to try to replace it with one in English. Okay. The NLT is going to be more focused on let's try to figure out the meaning of the text and then put that into English, maybe in a way that's different than one-to-one correspondence between word to word. And the NIV is somewhere in the middle. So all the translations, though, agree. So here are three different translations with three different philosophies on how to translate. And they all agree, though, about this one line. I've highlighted it in red. Again, for those who are just listening, I'll just read it. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. This is the phrase that we're going to look at. So this is the NIV here. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. The NLT is similar. He was oppressed and treated harshly, yet he never said a word. Okay, so here the NLT is being a little bit more creative with how they're saying it. Never said a word, right? And that, again, reflects their translation philosophy. I'm not going to say anything good or bad about their philosophy. I'm just saying it's different. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep is silent before the shearers, he did not open his mouth. Okay, so again, that same phrase, he did not open his mouth. The NLT, the first time translates, he never said a word, and the second time, he did not open his mouth. The ESV is very similar to the NIV. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. So from this, the question is, especially if you know Hebrew, what should we expect the Hebrew to be? So there are three different verb forms in Hebrew that can be negated. Okay, the three are yiktul, katal, and kotel, or the participle. So again, you don't need to know any of this. If you don't know all the terms, that's okay. I'm just going to explain what this means. Okay, if you just looked at the English translations, you would expect he did not open his mouth to be a katal form, right? Because katal normally refers to things that are in the past or things that have been done. So in English, we will often translate this with he has opened his mouth, something like that in the positive form, or he opened his mouth. Okay, those are the two most common translations of the katal form into English. So here we have that translation, right? But in the Hebrew, we actually don't have that form. We have the yiktul form. So again, the yiktul form is most of the time, about 80% of the time, it's translated from Hebrew into English with a future tense form. So here we have, in Hebrew, it says, velo yiftach piv, which is, again, if you were to just take it in an out of the blue context, the normal translation you would have is he will not open his mouth. Okay. But none of our translations go for that, right? None of them say he will not open his mouth. They all make this, he did not open his mouth in the past tense, just normal, he didn't do this thing. So how should we understand this difference, right? I mean, in Hebrew, it's different. And what's actually interesting is that there is a manuscript in Qumran that has patach. So that's the katal form in this context. And they also are seeing, okay, this is a past tense context. And so there is a manuscript of Isaiah with velo patach piv. And so maybe that is justification for the English translations as well, to just follow the Dead Sea Scroll evidence here and say, okay, maybe that's actually the correct written form. I'm going to suggest a different interpretation that does justice to the yiktul form, but is not just plain old past. Okay. And that is what is called a modal interpretation. And in English, we have these modal verb forms: should, might, can, would, right? All of these are English modals, and they have different meanings, right? If I said, I should open my mouth. That means one thing. I can open my mouth means another thing, etc., etc. So the ictal form, it is normally translated with future, will. But actually, even in English, will, could be argued, is a modal. It's a modal verb. So it is very similar to can, right? I can open my mouth. I will open my mouth. It occupies a very similar spot in the syntax. So the question is there another? So will doesn't work here, and translations have recognized that. But is there another kind of modal verb or idea that might fit this context? And in fact, the ictal form is used in past tense context with these modal ideas. So there's an example in Exodus with he could not gather something, and that's this ictal form in the past tense context with the negator. Okay, so I'm going to suggest, so if we go back to our translations, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he would not open his mouth, is actually the better understanding here. So this is not just reporting what this person did, right? It's suggesting. So when I say that he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he would not open his mouth, it suggests that there's something that is compelling him to open his mouth, but he doesn't do it. That's the idea here. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he would not open his mouth, and he would not open his mouth. So the idea is that there is reason to open your mouth, right? Actually, if you are being led like a lamb to the slaughter, then you should open your mouth. But despite this, he doesn't. And this is, again, the point here is that you actually lose that in the translations that have been provided in the NIV, NLT, and ESV. You lose this flavor of there's something that is compelling him to open his mouth, and he doesn't, even despite reason to. So that is, I suggest, the proper way to understand Isaiah 53:7.